In this industry, we have the rare luxury of getting to do what we love for a living. Then that we celebrate those we've lost, who we will always remain hopelessly devoted to.
John Travolta spent decades becoming one of Hollywood's most recognizable stars while quietly carrying a lifetime of loss that the public never fully understood. From his rise as a global teen idol to the devastating tragedies that followed him through every stage of fame, his life has often looked like a story written in extremes. But behind the success, the awards, and the public image, there has always been a deeper question about how he kept going when so much was taken from him. So what is John Travolta finally revealing after years of silence? Join us as we uncover what John Travolta is finally revealing after years of speculation. The question that never went away. For most people, John Travolta is the man who danced his way into Hollywood history. John was the star of Saturday Night Fever, the heartthrob from Grease, and the actor who reinvented himself in Pulp Fiction. Having spent decades as one of the most recognizable faces in entertainment, John built a steady reputation around the Hollywood industry. But that is only part of the story. Behind the fame, the awards, and the red carpets is a question that has followed him for years. How does someone keep going after losing so much? People kept asking it because of the many sad events in his life and how he continued working despite them. It was a question that became even harder to ignore in recent years. As John Travolta appeared more frequently in public, fans have noticed something different. He seemed lighter, more open, and more willing to talk about grief, healing, and the lessons that came from surviving life's darkest moments. His appearance changed, and with every interview, people have become increasingly curious about what he has learned through decades of heartbreak. It is this contrast that has shaped how the public now views him. Because when people look at John Travolta today, they are not just looking at a Hollywood star. They are looking at a man who has endured deep darkness and carried more grief than most people face in an entire lifetime. Yet somehow, he kept moving forward. However, to understand how difficult life became for John Travolta, you have to go back to how it all started. Because before the losses, before the silence and the speculations that followed, John had already built a name the world would never forget. Building the John Travolta brand. John Travolta was born in Englewood, New Jersey, in 1954. He was the youngest of 6 children in a home where ambition had to compete with survival. Money was scarce, but Travolta's household was active and filled with energy. His mother, Helen, filled it with discipline and structure. Helen had been a singer and later a teacher, and she treated creativity like something essential. From her, he learned early that talent meant nothing without commitment. His father worked long hours selling tires, returning home exhausted and with hands marked by labor. In that environment, success was not expected. It was something you had to fight for. However, Helen saw something different in her youngest son, and she pushed him toward theater and music. By his mid-teens, John made a decision that changed everything. With his parents' permission, he dropped out of high school and left New Jersey behind. Most people his age were still trying to figure out who they were. He was already betting his entire life on becoming someone entirely different. He moved to New York with little more than determination and the belief that he could survive the city long enough to be seen. The early years were unforgiving. He took whatever work he could find. He joined the touring production of Grease in its early stage, not as Danny Zuko, but in supporting roles, learning the rhythm of a show that would later define his career. He appeared in Over Here, a Broadway production that closed quickly and left little behind except experience and survival instinct. Luckily for him, television eventually gave him a breakthrough. After his appearance on Welcome Back, Cotter introduced him as Vinnie Barbarino, a character who carried an attitude and effortless presence. It was the kind of role that did not just make him recognizable, it made him unforgettable. Teen audiences connected immediately, and his name spread fast, carried by posters, magazine covers, and television screens across America. Then everything accelerated. Saturday Night Fever turned him into a cultural force. The role of Tony Manero did more than showcase his talent. The image of him in a white suit under flashing lights became one of the most recognizable film moments of the decade. Hollywood moved quickly after that. Grease arrived and pushed him even further. As Danny Zuko, John Travolta became a global superstar. The film became a success and a cultural landmark. At the peak of his early fame, he received an Academy Award nomination, confirming what the industry already believed. His other feature film musical credits included Staying Alive, 1983. By his mid-20s, he had reached a level of fame most actors spend a lifetime chasing. However, from the outside, everything looked complete. Success and recognition had arrived faster than anyone could have predicted. But while the world was watching John Travolta become a star, something devastating was already happening behind the scenes. Fame came with a price. Fame arrived fast for John Travolta, but it did not arrive alone. It came with something far heavier, something he would only understand when it was already too late to change the course of it. In 1976, while working on the television film The Boy in the Plastic Bubble, he met Diana Hyland. She was an established actress with years of experience behind her. He was 22, still new to the weight of attention that was building around him. Diana played his mother in the film, but what developed off-camera did not follow any script. The age gap was noticeable, but it never mattered to them. What started as conversations on set quickly turned into something deeper. John later described it as an instant connection, saying he had never felt that kind of certainty before. They spent time together constantly, talking for hours, laughing between scenes, and building a bond that felt steady in a life that was changing too quickly. For John, this was not a passing relationship. He began speaking about a future with her. They talked about living together, about marriage, about building a life outside of Hollywood noise. Around him, his career was beginning to shift into something larger. But privately, his focus was no longer just on work. It was on Diana. Then came the moment everything changed. Diana had battled breast cancer before they met. She believed she had recovered, and she wanted to believe life had moved past it. But during the time they were planning their future, the illness returned. This time, it did not leave room for optimism. It spread quickly, and the reality became impossible to ignore. John stepped away from filming to be with her. While Saturday Night Fever was still in production, he left Los Angeles and went to her side. The film that would define his career was happening at the same time his personal life was breaking apart. He moved between two worlds, one filled with cameras and success, the other with hospital rooms and waiting silence. Diana's condition worsened until no treatment options remained. Nevertheless, John stayed with her through it all. In her final days, the conversations became smaller, stripped of everything except presence. Sadly, she died in his arms in 1977. It was a deeply painful moment for both Diana's family and John. Although she had undergone a mastectomy 2 years earlier, John later said she only realized the illness was terminal about 2 weeks before her death. He was only 23 years old when this happened. At the exact moment the world was preparing to celebrate him as one of Hollywood's brightest new stars, he was experiencing a loss that did not leave room for celebration. Diana was survived by her son, Zachary Goodson, who was only 3 years old at the time Diana died. The contrast between public success and private grief became impossible to separate. John still had to promote Saturday Night Fever, still had to appear in interviews, still had to stand in front of cameras while carrying something that could not be seen. The film became a massive cultural success. It defined an era and placed him at the center of global attention. But behind every appearance, there was a silence that never left him. What followed should have been the beginning of stability for him. Instead, it became a slow shift in direction. The early 1980s brought a series of films that failed to match the momentum of his earlier success. His projects underperformed, and opportunities that once seemed guaranteed became uncertain. Hollywood moved quickly. The industry that had once built him up began turning its attention elsewhere. Through all of it, the memory of Diana remained. However, it did not end there. While John thought he had survived the worst loss of his life, he had no idea tragedy was only beginning. The losses no one could ignore. Grief did not arrive in John Travolta's life as a single event. It came in waves, each one arriving before the last had fully settled. What began as personal loss slowly turned into a pattern that could no longer be ignored. The first was the loss of his mother, Helen Travolta, who shaped his earliest understanding of discipline and belief in possibility. When she was diagnosed with cancer, the family tried to keep things low, without drawing attention to what was unfolding behind closed doors. In 1978, she was gone. For John, it marked the loss of the one person who had been present from the very beginning of his journey. The timing made it heavier. He was still trying to establish himself in a career that had only just begun to take shape. Even so, he was recovering from the death of his beloved, Diana. There was no pause for recovery. Years later, he found stability with Kelly Preston. Their relationship developed into marriage, bringing a different kind of foundation into his life. Together, they built a family away from constant public attention. They had 3 children, Jet, Ella, and Benjamin. For a time, things felt grounded. There were routines, shared responsibilities, and a grounded family life. But beneath that stability, challenges were already emerging. Jet, their first child, lived with autism and experienced seizures from a young age. The family adapted their lives around his needs, focusing on his care and safety. John often remained close to him, prioritizing time at home over public appearances whenever possible. In January 2009, while the family was in the Bahamas, everything changed in a matter of moments. Jet suffered a seizure and collapsed in the bathroom. John attempted to revive him, performing CPR in a desperate effort to bring him back. Despite everything done in those moments, Jet did not survive. He was 16 when he passed away, leaving the family in another dark phase. The aftermath of that day did not remain private. In the weeks following Jet's death in the Bahamas, the family was drawn into a public legal battle when 2 individuals were accused of attempting to extort $25 million from John and Kelly. The case centered on threats to release private and sensitive information related to the circumstances of Jet's death, unless a large financial payment was made. The incident, already devastating in its own right, became even more painful as it shifted from a private family tragedy into a matter played out in court under public scrutiny. The family ultimately withdrew from the case, choosing to step away from the public battle and focus on healing within their own space. Life continued again, but it did not return to what it had been. In 2010, Benjamin was born. His arrival brought a new sense of steadiness into the home. But the family's foundation would be tested once more. In 2018, Kelly Preston was diagnosed with breast cancer. The illness was kept largely private, and treatment took place away from public attention. She spent 2 years undergoing care, focusing on her health and her family while maintaining as much normalcy as possible. Those closest to her understood the seriousness of the situation, but much of the world did not. She continued to fight quietly until 2020. That year, Kelly Preston passed away at the age of 57. Her death marked another turning point for John, not because it was unexpected in hindsight, but because it repeated a pattern that had already shaped much of his life. Illness had taken the people closest to him before. This time, it did so again under similar circumstances to events that appeared in earlier chapters of his story. In a public message, he acknowledged her passing with simplicity, focusing on gratitude, her care, and the family they had built together. By 2020, John Travolta had lost his first love, his mother, his son, and his wife. Most people would never recover from a single one of those losses. But even as the questions around his life grew louder, John Travolta never felt the need to explain everything, disappearing from the spotlight. John Travolta has never built his public identity around explanation. Even at the peak of his fame, he kept his personal life tightly separated from his work, offering only brief glimpses into what was happening behind the scenes. When tragedy entered his life, that boundary did not weaken. It became even more defined. A major part of this approach has been shaped by his long-standing connection to Scientology. For decades, John has been one of the organization's most visible celebrity members alongside Tom Cruise. Its teachings emphasize personal responsibility, internal processing, and structured ways of dealing with emotional distress. Within that framework, pain is not something typically performed publicly. It is something addressed privately, through reflection and discipline. That perspective aligns closely with how he has handled personal hardship throughout his life. Rather than explaining grief in detail to the public, he has often treated it as something to be worked through away from attention. Over the years, this distance between public curiosity and private restraint only grew. Regardless, John remained consistent in one principle. He would speak when he chose to, not when it was expected of him. For decades, that silence was interpreted in many ways. But over time, silence was no longer the only thing defining him. Something in his life began to change, and it became obvious in the way he started to move through life again. Learning to keep living. Despite years of maintaining silence, John Travolta has gradually begun to speak about life in a different way. Not in the language of fame or performance, but with something quieter, shaped by experience and time. One of the clearest shifts has been in how he talks about loss with his children. With his son Benjamin, he has had conversations about death that are simple, direct, and honest. He does not hide the reality of it. He explains it as part of life, something that everyone eventually faces. What matters, he tells him, is not fear, but how you continue living while still carrying love for those who are gone. That approach shows a change in how he lives day to day. For years after his losses, life felt like something he was moving through rather than living inside. Over time, that changed. Slowly, he began reconnecting with parts of life that had been set aside. Travel became one of them. He started spending more time with his daughter Ella, joining her on trips and public events, including a widely noticed visit to Paris during the Olympics. Those moments were not about returning to a past version of himself, but about building something new with what remained. He also began to appear more often in settings that were personal rather than professional. One of the most defining parts of this later chapter has been aviation. John has been a licensed pilot for decades and has often spoken about flying as something that gives him clarity. He lives in a home built around that passion, an aviation estate in Florida with its own private runway. Planes are not just a hobby for him, but something about how he organizes his life. In a symbolic gesture that drew attention, he donated his Boeing 707 aircraft to be preserved and restored. John also continued to work in the Hollywood industry. His recent years have remained connected to film, though on a smaller and more selective scale than his peak Hollywood era. He has appeared in independent and mid-budget productions such as Paradise City and Cash Out, taking roles that reflect a shift toward veteran character work rather than leading blockbuster dominance. Alongside acting, he has stayed visible through occasional television appearances and industry events that highlight his long-standing place in Hollywood history. Rather than stepping away entirely, he has continued to engage with the screen in a controlled way, choosing projects that allow him to stay active in storytelling without the intensity of his earlier career peak. In the end, one thing that stands out about John Travolta after decades of loss is his belief that life still has to be lived fully. After everything John Travolta has lived through, do you think someone can ever fully heal from losses like these? And beyond what the public sees, what parts of his story do you think still remain untold? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.